On a crisp autumn morning in Smyrna, Georgia, Julia Roberts pulled her rental car to the curb, the familiar streets of her hometown both foreign and intimate all at once. She adjusted her sunglasses, a futile attempt at anonymity in the place that had known her long before the world did. The quaint downtown had changed, new storefronts, fresh paint, progress, but the bones of it remained the same. Julia had returned for what the production team called atmospheric research, preparing for her role as a Southern woman returning to her roots. What better research than actually coming home? She smiled at the irony as she stepped out of the car, autumn leaves crunching beneath her boots. The streets were relatively quiet this Tuesday morning. A few people glanced her way, doing double takes that Julia had long ago learned to pretend not to notice. 25 years in the spotlight had taught her the delicate dance of being seen without acknowledging being recognized. She wandered past the old cinema where she'd spent countless Saturday afternoons as a teenager, dreaming of seeing herself on that very screen someday. The marquee was different now, the building renovated, but the magic of those memories remained untouched. It was as she turned onto Maple Street that Julia saw her, a slight figure sitting alone at the bus stop, grey hair pulled back in a loose bun, shoulders curved forward as if carrying an invisible weight. There was something so achingly familiar about the profile, the way the woman's hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced like she was perpetually ready to make a point. Julia slowed her pace, her heart suddenly racing with a certainty she couldn't explain. Those hands had once moved expressively through the air while explaining Shakespeare. That voice had once read "To Kill a Mockingbird" with such passion that even the rowdiest boys in class fell silent. Ms. Harrington? The name fell from Julia's lips before she could stop it. The woman turned, squinting slightly against the morning sun. Her face, once animated and commanding, now carried deep lines of struggle. Her clothes, while clean, were visibly worn, the fabric faded from too many washes. But her eyes, those keen, intelligent eyes that had once seen such promise in a shy, gangly girl with big dreams, they were unmistakable. Recognition dawned slowly on the older woman's face, followed immediately by something that looked almost like shame. She straightened, attempting to regain some of the dignified posture that had once made her classroom presence so formidable. "Julia Roberts," she said, her voice carrying the slight tremor of age, but still rich with that teacher's authority. "My goodness." Julia moved closer, removing her sunglasses, all thoughts of remaining incognito forgotten. "It's really you, I can't believe it." Ms. Harrington smiled, but there was something guarded in her expression. "In the flesh, though not quite as you might remember me." Julia sat down beside her on the bench, noticing now the scuffed edges of Ms. Harrington's shoes, the thin jacket that was hardly adequate for the autumn chill, the tote bag beside her that seemed to contain everything she deemed essential. "What are you doing here?" Julia asked, then immediately regretted the question. Something was clearly wrong. The Ms. Harrington she remembered had been polished, put together, a woman who commanded respect through her very presence, waiting for the 9:15 bus. Ms. Harrington answered simply, glancing at her wristwatch. The same one Julia remembered from high school, she realized with a pang. A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Julia noticed how Ms. Harrington's hands trembled slightly, whether from age or cold she couldn't tell. On impulse, she reached out and covered those familiar hands with her own. "It's wonderful to see you," Julia said softly, meaning it. No, I was just thinking about you the other day during an interview. They asked who influenced my love of storytelling, and there you were in my answer." Something flickered in Miss Harrington's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or a hint of her former pride. "You always had that gift, Julia, long before I met you. I just gave you the words to shape it." Julia smiled, remembering the 16-year-old girl who'd been too terrified to read her essay aloud, until Miss Harrington stood beside her desk, a quiet, steadying presence. "Do you live around here now?" Julia asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Though the question was anything but. Miss Harrington hesitated, her gaze drifting to the street before them. "More or less," she answered vaguely. A bus rumbled in the distance, and Miss Harrington reached for her bag, a signal that their unexpected reunion was about to end. "Wait," Julia said, suddenly desperate to hold on to this moment. to understand what had happened in the years between. Let me buy you coffee or breakfast. I'd love to catch up properly. Miss Harrington's grip tightened on her bag. That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose on your time. I'm sure you're busy with— I'm not, Julia interrupted gently. Not today. Please, Miss Harrington, for old time's sake? The older woman looked at her then, really looked at her, as if assessing whether the invitation was sincere or merely polite. Whatever she saw in Julia's expression seemed to convince her. There's a cafe around the corner, she said finally. Nothing fancy, but the coffee is decent. Julia stood, offering her arm without making a show of it. After a moment's hesitation, Miss Harrington accepted, her touch light but present. As they walked, Julia felt the weight of stares from passers-by, not at her, for once, but at the odd pair they made, a globally recognized movie star and an elderly woman in threadbare clothes. But there was a rightness to it that transcended appearances. This woman had seen Julia's potential when she was nothing but potential. She had nurtured the spark that would eventually become a flame. And something was wrong, terribly unjustly wrong. Julia could feel it in the careful way Miss Harrington carried herself, in the things she wasn't saying. The bus rolled past them, but Miss Harrington didn't look back. Whatever destination she'd been headed toward would have to wait. Julia had no way of knowing it then, but this chance encounter on a quiet Smyrna morning would change not just Miss Harrington's life, but her own, and eventually it would ripple outward to change many more. The cafe was a small, weathered establishment with mismatched chairs and the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee. Julia held the door open as Miss Harrington stepped inside, noticing how her former teacher scanned the room, a quick, almost imperceptible assessment of the exits, the occupants, the safest corner to settle in. It was the vigilance of someone who had learned to navigate the world with caution. They found a table near the back, partially obscured by a potted plant. A blessing, Julia thought, as she wasn't in the mood to be recognized. The waitress did. A double take, but to her credit, maintained her composure as she took their order. Black coffee for Miss Harrington, a latte for Julia. You haven't changed much, Miss Harrington said, her hands folded neatly on the table. Same expressive eyes. Same smile that lights up your whole face, Julia laughed softly. And yet everything's changed. She studied the woman across from her, trying to reconcile this diminished figure with the commanding presence who once strode between desks, reciting poetry from memory. You used to wear these bright scarves, different one every day. Something flickered in Miss Harrington's eyes, a memory perhaps, or the pain of its loss. I still have a few tucked away somewhere. Their drinks arrived, steam rising in delicate curls. Miss Harrington wrapped her fingers around the mug, absorbing its warmth. The simple gesture made Julia's chest tighten. Do you remember that Shakespeare competition in junior year? Julia asked, steering towards safer ground. When you made me try out even though I was terrified? Miss Harrington's face softened. Ophelia's mad scene. You were brilliant. I was petrified. My knees were literally knocking together. But you did it. Anyway, that's courage, Julia. Not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. She took a careful sip of her coffee. You've certainly lived by that principle. Julia smiled, remembering the 16-year-old girl who'd stood trembling on stage, finding her voice for perhaps the first time. You gave me that. The belief that I could be more than my fears. Miss Harrington waved away the compliment. You already had everything you needed. I just pointed it out to you. They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who once knew each other well and are rediscovering the familiar contours of their connection. But beneath it ran an undercurrent of unspoken questions. Finally, Julia gathered her courage. Miss Harrington, what happened? After I left Smyrna, after graduation? The older woman's gaze dropped to her coffee cup, her fingers tracing its rim. Life happened, Julia. Nothing dramatic, just a slow accumulation of misfortunes. She sighed. The school cut the English department budget. Then they started combining classes. Eventually they offered early retirement packages, strongly encouraged if you understand my meaning. Julia nodded, her throat tight. I thought I'd be fine. I had savings, a small pension. Then came the diagnosis. Ms. Harrington's voice remained steady, matter-of-fact. Breast cancer, stage 2, treatable but expensive, even with insurance. She shrugged. Medical bills have a way of devouring decades of careful planning. Julia felt a flash of anger, at the system, at the unfairness of it all. But surely there were people who could help, former students, colleagues. I'm not one for charity, Ms. Harrington said, a hint of her old pride surfacing. Besides, everyone has their own struggles. I couldn't bear to impose. It's not imposing when people love you, Julia said gently. Ms. Harrington smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Perhaps. Regardless, by the time things became truly dire, I'd lost touch with most everyone, sold the house to pay for treatments, moved into a small apartment, then a smaller one. She gestured vaguely. Now it's a room at the Pinewood Motel, week to week when I can manage it. The casual way she described her descent into poverty made it all the more heartbreaking. Julia thought of her own home in Malibu, the apartment in New York, the villa in Italy. The unfairness of it all felt like a physical weight on her chest. I substitute teach when I can, Ms. Harrington continued, as if eager to assure Julia that she wasn't completely without resources. And there's a food pantry at First Baptist on Thursdays. Julia tried to mask her shock, but Ms. Harrington caught it anyway. She straightened in her chair, that teacher's dignity reasserting itself. I didn't tell you this to make you feel sorry for me, Julia. It's just life. Unpredictable and occasionally unkind. No, I know that, Julia said quickly. It's just... She struggled to find the right words. You gave so much to so many of us. You shaped who we became. Ms. Harrington smiled, genuine this time. And look what you became. That's enough reward for any teacher. A memory surfaced in Julia's mind. Ms. Harrington staying after school to help her prepare for a drama school audition, refusing payment for the extra hours, insisting it was her pleasure. You used to tell us that stories have power, Julia said softly, that they can change the world. Did I? How philosophical of me. You did. And you were right. Julia reached across the table, taking Ms. Harrington's hand in hers. Your story isn't over yet. Ms. Harrington's eyes glistened with unshed tears. At my age, dear, the remaining chapters are rather short. Quality over quantity, Julia countered with a gentle squeeze of her hand, and I think I might have a few ideas for an interesting plot twist. Ms. Harrington excused herself to use the restroom, and Julia watched her go, noticing the careful way she moved, conserving energy. The moment she was out of sight, Julia pulled out her phone and stepped outside the cafe. Mark, she said when her assistant answered, I need you to book a suite at the best hotel in Smyrna, Georgia, immediately. She paused, looking back through the window at the empty table. And then I need you to clear my schedule for the next few days. Something important has come up. As she ended the call, Julia knew with absolute certainty that her return to Smyrna had nothing to do with movie research and everything to do with this moment, this woman, this chance to repay a debt she hadn't known she was carrying. When Ms. Harrington returned to the table, Julia had already settled their bill and was waiting with a warm smile that concealed the storm of emotions beneath. She watched her former teacher ease back into the chair, noting the slight wince, arthritis perhaps, or the lingering effects of treatments that had saved her life but depleted her finances. I've been thinking, Julia said, keeping her tone casual. I'm in town for a few days, staying at the Piedmont Hotel. They've given me this ridiculously large suite with an extra bedroom that's just sitting empty. She stirred her latte, not making eye contact. It seems a waste, really. Ms. Harrington's expression shifted subtly, wariness replacing the brief moment of contentment they'd shared. Julia. It would actually be a favor to me, Julia continued, before she could object. I hate rattling around in big hotel rooms alone. Makes me feel like I'm in a mausoleum. I appreciate the thought, but I couldn't possibly... You used to tell us that pride makes poor company on cold nights, Julia interrupted gently, recalling one of Ms. Harrington's favorite sayings. You taught me that accepting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Ms. Harrington let out a small laugh, tinged with both amusement and resignation. "Using my own words against me, that's hardly fair. I learned from the best." Julia reached across the table, her expression growing serious. "Please, just for a few days, consider it a chance for us to catch up properly." Something in Miss Harrington's face suggested she was wavering, weighing pride against practicality. Finally, she sighed. "Very well, but only for a night or two." Relief washed over Julia. It was a small victory, but a critical one. "Perfect, my car's just down the street." They walked together in comfortable silence, Julia slowing her naturally brisk pace to match Miss Harrington's more measured steps. At the rental car, Julia opened the passenger door, pretending not to notice how carefully Miss Harrington lowered herself into the seat. "We'll need to stop by the motel," Miss Harrington said as Julia slid behind the wheel. "I should gather my things." Julia nodded, following Miss Harrington's directions through streets she barely remembered. The Pinewood Motel appeared ahead, a single-story structure with peeling paint and a flickering vacancy sign. Julia's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral as she parked in front of room 118. "I won't be but a minute," Miss Harrington said, reaching for the door handle. "I'll help," Julia replied, already stepping out of the car. The motel room was meticulously clean but desperately sparse, a testament to Miss Harrington's dignity in the face of hardship. A single bed occupied most of the space, its thin mattress covered with a faded quilt that Julia recognized from her teacher's classroom. A small table held a hot plate and a single mug. Books, dozens of them, were stacked neatly against one wall, clearly treasured possessions that had survived every downsizing. Miss Harrington moved efficiently around the space, gathering a few clothes and toiletries into a worn duffel bag. Julia spotted a familiar volume on the nightstand, a collected works of Shakespeare, its spine cracked from decades of use. "You still have it," she said softly, running her fingers along the book's worn cover. Miss Harrington glanced over. "Some things you don't part with, no matter how dire the circumstances." Julia nodded, understanding completely. She helped gather the remaining items, noting with a pang how few personal possessions her teacher had managed to hold on to. 20 minutes. Later, they were pulling up to the Piedmont Hotel, a renovated historic building that stood as Smyrna's finest accommodation. The valet rushed forward, recognition flashing across his face as he opened Julia's door. "Welcome back, Ms. Roberts." Miss Harrington tensed slightly beside her, perhaps only now fully realizing what it meant to be in Julia Roberts's orbit. The attention, the treatment, the stark contrast to her own anonymity of recent years. Julia breezed through the lobby, her arm linked protectively through Miss Harrington's, nodding politely at the starstruck staff but not slowing until they reached the elevator. Once inside, Miss Harrington exhaled, her shoulders dropping slightly. "I forgot what it's like," she murmured. "Being near celebrity." Julia squeezed her arm gently. "Trust me, it gets old fast." The suite was on the top floor, spacious and elegant without being ostentatious. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the small town spreading out below them, autumn colors painting the landscape in golds and reds. "The second bedroom is through there," Julia said, indicating a door to the right. "Make yourself at home. I've asked them to bring up some tea." Miss Harrington stood in the center of the living area, looking slightly lost amidst the luxury. "This is very kind of you, Julia." "It's nothing," Julia replied, meaning it. She watched as Miss Harrington moved to the window, gazing out at the town she'd lived in for decades, but perhaps never seen from this vantage point. A knock at the door announced the arrival of room service. Not just tea, but a selection of sandwiches, fruits and pastries that Julia had ordered, while Miss Harrington was gathering her things at the motel. "I thought you might be hungry," Julia said simply, gesturing to the spread. They ate together, conversation flowing more easily now as they moved from past to present, filling in the years between. Julia shared stories of film sets and co-stars, while Miss Harrington spoke of former students whose lives she'd followed from a distance. It was only when Miss Harrington excused herself to rest that Julia stepped onto the suite's balcony and made another call. "Mark, I need a few more things," she said quietly. "Contact my stylist. I need a selection of clothes delivered to the hotel. Size 6, I think, classic styles, nothing flashy. And toiletries, high quality but simple. Books too, contemporary fiction, maybe some poetry. She paused. And find out who's the best oncologist in Atlanta, just in case. I want to know our options. As she ended the call, Julia noticed Ms. Harrington standing in the doorway of the guest bedroom, a soft robe from the hotel wrapped around her thin frame. Their eyes met, and in that moment Julia knew her teacher had overheard at least part of the conversation. "You don't have to do all this," Miss Harrington said softly. Julia crossed the room to her, taking her hands. "I know I don't have to," she said firmly. "I want to. There's a difference." Miss Harrington's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to accept this kind of help, Julia. I never prepared for this chapter." Julia smiled gently. "Then we'll write it together, one page at a time." After the meeting, they toured the building, stopping to observe classes in session. Julia noticed the overcrowding, the outdated textbooks, the teachers who looked perpetually exhausted. In the teacher's lounge, a dingy room with a malfunctioning coffee maker and furniture that had seen better decades, they encountered a math teacher on her planning period. She recognized Miss Harrington immediately. "So you're the reason I became a teacher," she said, eyes bright with admiration. "Your methods course at the community college changed my life." Miss Harrington blinked in surprise. "Sarah Patel. My goodness, you were one of my best students," Sarah smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm considering leaving the profession," she admitted. "My student loans are crushing me, and with 2 kids," she trailed off, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, that's not your problem." "It's everyone's problem," Julia said quietly. Outside in the car, Miss Harrington was silent, staring at the school building, as if seeing it, and all it represented, with new clarity. "You're not alone," Julia said finally. "What happened to you? It's happening to teachers everywhere." Miss Harrington sighed. "That doesn't make it right." "No," Julia agreed. "It doesn't." Back at the hotel, a delivery awaited them, several garment bags and packages that Julia had arranged. Miss Harrington began to protest, but Julia gently cut her off. "Consider it a loan if it makes you more comfortable." While Miss Harrington rested, Julia sat on the balcony with her laptop, researching teacher poverty statistics, pension systems, and education funding disparities. The numbers were staggering, the stories heartbreaking. Teachers living in cars, retiring into poverty after decades of service, working multiple jobs just to afford basic necessities. And then there were the success stories, private foundations supporting educators, community initiatives providing housing for retired teachers, corporate partnerships funding innovative solutions. An idea began to take shape in Julia's mind, nebulous at first, but gaining clarity with each article she read, each statistic she digested. By the time Miss Harrington emerged for dinner, Julia had filled a hotel notepad with thoughts, possibilities, and one underlined phrase that would become their rallying cry: "Education doesn't end with retirement." "You look like you're plotting something," Miss Harrington observed, settling into a chair across from her. Julia smiled, closing her laptop. "Just thinking about something you once taught us, that stories have power, especially the ones that need to be told." "And which story is that?" Julia met her gaze steadily. "Yours. And every teacher who gave everything to their students only to find themselves forgotten when they needed help most." Miss Harrington's eyes widened slightly. "Julia, what exactly are you planning?" "Something big," Julia admitted. "But I can't do it without you." "A foundation?" Miss Harrington repeated, her teacup suspended halfway to her lips. "For teachers." They sat in the hotel suite's living area, afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the carpet. Julia nodded, her excitement barely contained, as she outlined the idea that had consumed her thoughts for the past 24 hours. "Not just any foundation," she clarified, "but one specifically focused on retired educators facing financial hardship, people who devoted their lives to shaping future generations only to find themselves struggling in their golden years." Ms. Harrington set down her cup carefully. "It's a lovely thought, Julia, but surely there are already organizations—" "None with the scope I'm envisioning," Julia interrupted gently. "I've spent all morning on calls with my financial team. We've researched existing support systems, and while there are some, they're underfunded and overwhelmed. Most focus on current teachers, not retirees. Ms. Harrington's expression remained skeptical. And what exactly would this foundation do? Julia leaned forward, eyes bright with purpose. Provide emergency housing assistance, help with medical bills, create affordable living communities specifically for retired teachers, offer legal advocacy for pension rights. She paused. And most importantly, raise awareness about the crisis facing educators who've aged out of the system that was supposed to protect them. A thoughtful silence fell between them. Ms. Harrington gazed out the window, her reflection superimposed over the Smyrna skyline. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. Why me, Julia? You could start this foundation without involving me at all. It was the question Julia had been expecting, the one she'd prepared for most carefully. She moved to sit beside her teacher on the couch, taking her weathered hands in her own. Do you remember my senior year, when I was cast as Laura? In the glass menagerie? Miss Harrington's face softened with the memory. Of course, you were magnificent. I was terrified, Julia corrected. I couldn't connect with the character, this fragile, shy girl so different from who I was. Remember what you told me? Miss Harrington smiled slightly. I believe I said that every character needs a beating. Heart, not just lines on a page. Julia nodded. You made me understand that stories, even difficult ones, need real people at their center, not abstractions or statistics. She squeezed Miss Harrington's hands gently. This foundation needs a beating heart, a real story that people can connect with. Your story. Miss Harrington withdrew her hands slowly, rising to pace the room. You're asking me to become the face of teacher poverty, to put my struggles on display for public consumption. I'm asking you to help thousands of teachers by sharing what happened to you, Julia countered softly, to turn your experience into purpose. Miss Harrington stopped at the window, her reflection wavering in the glass. I would be exposed, vulnerable. Yes, Julia acknowledged, but not alone. Never alone again. Outside, clouds drifted across the sun, momentarily dimming the room. Miss Harrington remained at the window, shoulders straight, despite the weight of decision pressing upon them. I need to think about this, she said finally. Julia nodded. Of course. Take all the time you need. The next morning, Julia arranged for a car to take Miss Harrington to visit her daughter in Marietta, their first reconnection in years, facilitated by Julia's gentle encouragement and a prepaid driver to eliminate the barrier of transportation. With the suite to herself, Julia convened a virtual meeting with her foundation team, her laptop screen filled with faces of financial advisors, publicity experts, and education policy consultants. We need to move quickly but carefully, she instructed, pacing the suite as she spoke. I want a name, a mission statement, and a concrete action plan by week's end. Mark, what did the lawyers say about establishing the non-profit status? Her assistant's voice came through clearly. They can expedite the process given the circumstances. They're drafting the paperwork now. Good. And Elise, what about potential? Corporate partners? The publicist's image filled the screen. I've compiled a list of education-friendly companies that might match donations. Several have already expressed interest after I made preliminary inquiries. Julia nodded, her mind racing ahead to next steps, contingencies, possibilities. Let's also identify other retired teachers in similar situations, people who might be willing to share their stories, alongside Ms. Harrington. The meeting continued for hours, the foundation taking shape with each decision, each assignment, each task delegated. By the time Ms. Harrington returned that evening, cheeks flushed from a day reconnecting with family, Julia had laid the groundwork for something that could potentially help thousands. How is your daughter? Julia asked, setting aside her laptop. Ms. Harrington's smile was genuine, if tinged with lingering sadness. Wonderful. We had much to discuss, much to repair. But she wants me to move in with her family. She paused, eyes meeting Julia's. I told her I need to consider another opportunity first. Julia's heart quickened. Does that mean... It means I'm listening, Ms. Harrington said carefully, settling into an armchair. Tell me more about this foundation. What would you call... Julia had been pondering this question for hours. I was thinking the Harrington Initiative, Miss Harrington blanched. My name? Julia? No, that's too much. It's perfect, Julia insisted. Your name represents everything the Foundation stands for: dedication, intelligence, the nurturing of potential. She leaned forward. And it personalizes the mission. It's not just about saving retirement funds. It's about saving the Ms. Harringtons of the world. Ms. Harrington fell silent, visibly processing the magnitude of what Julia proposed. May I show you something? Julia asked gently, picking up her laptop. She pulled up a simple web-page mock-up her team had created, elegant, dignified, featuring the proposed foundation name and a mission statement that distilled their purpose into a single, powerful sentence. Honoring those who taught us to dream by ensuring they can live with dignity. Ms. Harrington read it slowly, her expression inscrutable. Then, without warning, a memory seemed to surface. You were struggling with Ophelia's monologue, she said, her voice distant with recollection. You couldn't find the emotion behind. The madness. Julia nodded, remembering that afternoon rehearsal 30 years ago. I told you that sometimes the bravest thing is to let others see your pain, if it might help them understand their own. Ms. Harrington looked up, eyes suddenly, clear and decided. I should take my own advice, shouldn't I? Relief and joy flooded through Julia. Does that mean? It means yes, Ms. Harrington said firmly. If my story can help other teachers, then it should be told. But, she added, raising a warning finger, I will not be portrayed as a victim or an object of pity. I am an educator who fell on hard. Time's not a tragedy personified. Julia grinned, feeling the pieces of her plan clicking into place. Understood completely. No victimhood narratives, just honest storytelling about a system that fails the very people who strengthen it. Ms. Harrington nodded once decisively. Then let's begin. That evening they worked together at the suite's dining table, Ms. Harrington sharing details of her career, her cancer diagnosis, her financial descent, each element carefully noted by Julia for the Foundation's narrative. Occasionally, Ms. Harrington would pause, overcome by the emotional weight of revisiting difficult memories, but she always continued, her resolve strengthening with each story shared. You know, she said as they finished for the night, I used to tell my students that every great story contains a moment of transformation, a point when the protagonist decides to act rather than be acted upon. Julia smiled, recognizing the teaching moment. And is this yours? Ms. Harrington considered the question, her gaze drifting to the window where Smyrna's lights twinkled below. Perhaps, she said softly. Or perhaps it was that moment on the sidewalk when a former student recognized her teacher, despite everything that had changed between them. Julia felt tears prick her eyes. I think we're just getting to the good part of this story. Ms. Harrington smiled, the expression transforming her tired face into something luminous with purpose. Indeed, the part where we write the ending we choose. The Instagram post appeared at 7:03 a.m. Eastern Time, a simple photograph of two hands clasped together on a cafe table. One hand bore the unmistakable freckles that millions of fans would recognize instantly. The other was weathered, elegant with age, a teacher's hand that had once corrected countless essays and guided nervous students through Shakespeare. No filters, no staging, just raw authenticity. The caption read, 30 years ago, this hand guided mine when I was too scared to believe in myself. Today I found Ms. Harrington living in poverty after decades of shaping young minds. Her story is not unique. Thousands of retired teachers face the same struggle. It's time we honored those who taught us to dream. The Harrington Initiative. More to come. Julia put her phone away after posting, glancing across the hotel suite where Ms. Harrington sat, reading the draft press release for their foundation's official announcement. They had spent 3 days refining the language, ensuring it captured both urgency and dignity. Are you sure about this? Ms. Harrington asked, looking up from the pages. Once it begins, there's no going back. Julia nodded. I'm sure if you... Ms. Harrington took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders with the same posture that had commanded classroom attention for 3 decades. Then let's proceed. By noon, Julia's post had accumulated over 2 million likes and 50,000 comments. By 2 o'clock, entertainment news outlets were running the story. By 4, mainstream media had picked it up, speculating about Julia Roberts' mysterious new project involving education. Julia's publicist called, her voice tight with controlled excitement. CNN wants an interview. So does Good Morning America. The New York Times is doing a feature on teacher poverty and wants you both for an exclusive. Julia glanced at Ms. Harrington, who was watching a local news segment about their initiative on the hotel television, her expression a mixture of wonder and apprehension. "Tell them we'll consider it," Julia replied, "but we do this at Ms. Harrington's pace, not theirs." That evening, Julia's phone buzzed with a text from her co-star in the film she was supposed to be shooting. "Just donated to the Harrington Initiative website. Called my mom, retired kindergarten teacher, to check on her finances. This matters, Jules. Let me know how I can help." The website, hastily but professionally constructed by Julia's team, had gone live an hour after her social media post, featuring a simple donation portal and the promise of more information to come. Within 12 hours, it had raised $300,000. "They're responding," Julia told Ms. Harrington, showing her the donation tracker. "People care." Ms. Harrington shook her head in disbelief. "I never imagined—" A knock at the door interrupted them. It was the hotel manager, looking slightly flustered. "Ms. Roberts, I apologize for the intrusion, but there are several news vans outside the hotel, and we've received calls from—" He consulted a notepad. 17 retired teachers asking if they could speak with Ms. Harrington. Julia exchanged a glance with Ms. Harrington. "Thank you for letting us know. Please ensure our privacy is maintained, but could you take down the contact information for those teachers?" After he left, Ms. Harrington sank into a chair. "It's happening so fast." "It needs to," Julia said gently. "Momentum is everything with causes like this." "But we can slow down if you're feeling overwhelmed." Ms. Harrington squared her shoulders. "No, I've spent too long being invisible. Let's continue." The following morning brought a surprise visitor, Richard Atwell, the director of Julia's film. The hotel arranged for him to enter through a service entrance to avoid the growing media presence in the lobby. "You've created quite a stir," he said, accepting the coffee Julia offered. His gaze shifted to Ms. Harrington, whom he greeted with genuine respect. "The studio executives are calling me hourly for updates." Julia tensed. "I know I've disrupted the shooting schedule." Richard waved away her concern. "That's not why I'm here. The studio wants to support the initiative. They're offering to restructure our entire production schedule around your foundation launch," he smiled. "And they want rights to the story, your story, for a future project." Ms. Harrington blinked in surprise. "My story? But who would want to watch that?" "Everyone," Richard said simply. "It's compelling, it's meaningful, and it has Julia Roberts in it. That's the trifecta in this business." After he left, promising to send over proposals for their consideration, Julia found Ms. Harrington on the balcony, gazing at the horizon. "It's a lot to process," Julia acknowledged, joining her. "My life was so small just days ago," Ms. Harrington said quietly. "A motel room, a bus pass, daily concerns about basic necessities." She turned to Julia. "Now people want to make movies about me." "About us," Julia corrected gently. "About what happens when we recognize our shared humanity and responsibility to each other." Ms. Harrington nodded slowly. "I received an email from a former student, Sarah Chen, class of '02. She's a surgeon now in Seattle." A smile touched her lips. "She said she's creating a medical fund for retired teachers in my honor at her hospital." Julia felt warmth spread through her chest. "See? It's already creating ripples." That afternoon, Julia agreed to one carefully. Controlled interview with a respected journalist, known for her thoughtful coverage of social issues. The terms were explicit. The interview would take place in the hotel suite, no ambush questions, and Ms. Harrington would have final approval. Over what aired. The reporter Diane Carroll arrived with a minimal crew, just a camera person and sound technician. She spoke with Ms. Harrington first, her questions gentle but probing, drawing out the story of a dedicated educator's gradual descent into financial insecurity despite a lifetime of service. "What do you hope will come from sharing your story?" Diane asked. Ms. Harrington considered the question. Recognition that our society's priorities are misaligned when those who shape our children's futures cannot secure their own. And perhaps, she added with quiet dignity, a re-evaluation of how we define value in our culture. When it was Julia's turn, she spoke passionately about the Foundation's goals: emergency housing assistance, medical bill support, pension advocacy, and awareness. This isn't charity, she emphasized. It's correcting an injustice. Ms. Harrington gave 30 years to her students, to our community. She deserves security and dignity in return. The interview aired that evening on prime time, unedited as promised. By midnight, the Foundation's donation total had reached $2.3 million. Julia's phone rang just as she was preparing for bed. It was Mark, his voice crackling with excitement. "You need to see this," he said. 15 celebrities have posted about the initiative in the last hour. 3 major corporations have pledged matching donations, and Thompson, he mentioned a well-known tech billionaire, wants to endow a $10 million fund specifically for teacher housing. Julia sat on the edge of her bed, momentarily overwhelmed by the cascade of support. "It's really happening," she murmured. After ending the call, she walked to Ms. Harrington's room, finding her former teacher awake, reading messages on the tablet Julia had given her. "I've heard from students I taught 40 years ago," Ms. Harrington said wonderingly. "People I'd thought had forgotten me long ago." Julia smiled. "Good teachers are never truly forgotten." Ms. Harrington looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Tomorrow, the Today Show requested an interview. I think—" "I'm ready." Julia felt a surge of pride and protectiveness. "Then tomorrow it is, together." Later that night, Julia stood at her window watching the news vans parked outside the hotel, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. In just 3 days, they had created something that was rapidly taking on a life of its own, something bigger than either of them had imagined. Her phone buzzed with a text from the film's producer. Studio execs calling non-stop. "Everyone wants in on the Harrington story. This is bigger than the movie." "What do you need from us?" Julia smiled, typing back a simple response. "Time and a platform." She glanced toward Miss Harrington's closed door, thinking of the woman who had once commanded her classroom with authority and grace, now preparing to step onto a much larger stage. The same woman who had once told a shy teenage Julia that her voice mattered. Now it was Julia's turn to ensure that Miss Harrington's voice, and the voices of thousands like her, would finally be heard. The Atlanta Convention Center's grand ballroom had been transformed. Soft lighting cast a warm glow over the gathering crowd, a mix of educators, celebrities, business leaders, and media. At the entrance, elegant banners displayed the Foundation's logo, 2 hands clasped together, one young, one old, forming the shape of an open book. Beneath it, the words, "The Harrington Initiative, honoring those who taught us to dream," were emblazoned in dignified lettering. In a quiet room backstage, Julia watched as Ms. Harrington studied her reflection in the mirror. 3 weeks of proper nutrition, medical care, and rest had already begun to restore some of her former vitality. Her silver hair was styled simply but elegantly, and the navy blue dress, selected after careful consideration of Ms. Harrington's preferences, lent her an air of quiet authority. "You look perfect," Julia said, coming to stand beside her. "Ms. Harrington smiled nervously. "I haven't addressed a crowd this size since my retirement speech." She adjusted her glasses, a gesture Julia remembered from classroom days. "And that was hardly broadcast on national television." Julia squeezed her shoulder gently. "Just talk to them the way you talk to your students, with honesty and heart." A soft knock at the door announced Mark's arrival. "5 minutes," he said. "The governor just arrived, and the Secretary of Education is on her way in." Ms. Harrington's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded, the consummate professional despite her anxiety. "Remember," Julia said as they prepared to enter the ballroom, "tonight isn't about sad stories. It's about creating solutions." Ms. Harrington squared her shoulders, teacher posture returning instinctively. "Then let's educate them." The room fell silent as they walked onto the stage, applause sweeping through the audience like a wave. Julia stepped to the podium first, her practiced smile belying the butterflies in her stomach. This wasn't a movie premiere or award ceremony. The stakes felt infinitely higher. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady. "3 weeks ago, I returned to my hometown of Smyrna, Georgia, for what I thought was research for a film role. Instead, I found myself face to face with a truth we've been ignoring for too long. The audience was rapt, cameras flashing occasionally, despite requests for minimal photography. I recognized my former English teacher, Ms. Eleanor Harrington, waiting for a bus. The woman who had once commanded classrooms with wisdom and grace was living in poverty, struggling to survive on a pension that failed to cover even her basic needs after medical bills depleted her savings. Julia paused, allowing the reality to sink in. Ms. Harrington's story is not unique. Across America, thousands of retired educators face similar circumstances, people who devoted decades to shaping young minds only to find themselves forgotten by the very system they served. She gestured to the screens flanking the stage, where images appeared: retired teachers working as grocery cashiers in their 70s, an elderly man living in his car despite 35 years in education, former principal choosing between medication and food. Tonight, we launch the Harrington Initiative with a simple but powerful mission: to ensure that those who taught us to dream can live their later years with security and dignity. Julia outlined the Foundation's three-pronged approach: immediate, relief funds for educators in crisis; advocacy for pension reform and improved retirement benefits; and the creation of affordable housing communities specifically designed for retired teachers. "We've already raised $12 million, she announced, including matching grants from corporate partners and individual donors across the country. But more important than money is the message we're sending. Teachers matter. Their service matters. Their futures matter." She turned toward Miss Harrington, extending her hand. "And now it is my honor to introduce the woman whose courage and dignity inspired this movement, my teacher, my mentor, and now my partner in this initiative, Ms. Eleanor Harrington." The applause was thunderous as Ms. Harrington approached the podium. She waited for the room to quiet, surveying the audience with the patient gaze of someone accustomed to managing rowdy teenagers. "For 30 years, she began, her voice clear and unwavering, I stood before classrooms full of young people and told them that education was their path to security and fulfillment. I believed it then. I believe it still." She paused, adjusting her glasses. "What I didn't tell them, because I didn't know it myself, was that dedicating one's life to education could lead to financial insecurity in old age. That after decades of service, I would find myself unable to afford both medication and housing, that I would become invisible in the very community I had served." The room was utterly silent, hundreds of people leaning forward in their seats. "But this is not a story of victimhood," Ms. Harrington continued, her chin lifting slightly. "It is a call to re-examine our priorities as a society, to ask ourselves, what does it say about us when those entrusted with our children's minds and hearts are discarded once their teaching days are done?" She gestured to a table near the front, where 6 elderly people sat together, all former educators Julia had helped locate through the developing network of teacher advocates. Martin Taylor taught physics for 42 years. He now works night shifts at a warehouse to supplement his pension. Gloria Vasquez shaped young minds for 38 years. She lives with her daughter because her retirement benefits cannot cover rent in the city where she taught. James Wilson spent 35 years teaching music, and now cannot afford the hearing aids he needs to enjoy the art form he loves. Ms. Harrington's voice grew stronger with each introduction, her natural teaching authority filling the vast room. "We stand before you not as charity cases, but as professionals who fulfilled our end of a social contract only to find the terms changed when we were too old to begin again." She turned slightly toward Julia, a small smile softening her expression. 3 weeks ago, I was waiting for a bus, wondering how I would pay next week's motel bill. Today, I stand before you with renewed purpose, not just to improve my own circumstances, but to ensure no teacher ever faces what I faced. The first donation came before Ms. Harrington had even finished speaking. A tech executive, standing to announce a $5 million endowment for the Foundation's Emergency Housing Fund. Others quickly followed, a publishing company pledging 1 million for medical support. A hotel chain offering transitional housing in 5 major cities. A retired NBA player committing to fun teacher apartments in his hometown. By the time the formal presentations concluded, the foundation had secured commitments totaling over $20 million. At the reception afterward, Ms. Harrington found herself surrounded by former students, not just Julia's Hollywood connections, but ordinary people who had traveled from across the country after seeing the media coverage. A middle-aged man in a doctor's coat approached her, tears in his eyes. "You helped me apply for medical school scholarships," he said, taking her hand. "I just established a free clinic for retired teachers in your honor." A woman in her 30s embraced her. "Your creative writing class saved me during my parents' divorce. I'm a publisher now, and we're launching a book series written by retired teachers." Julia watched from across the room as Ms. Harrington, once isolated and nearly broken by circumstance, was surrounded by the living legacy of her work. She caught the eye of a prominent senator who had been observing the same scene. "This isn't just a foundation launch," the senator said quietly. "It's the beginning of a movement." Julia nodded. "That's exactly what it is." Later that night, as their car pulled away from the convention center, Ms. Harrington sat in uncharacteristic silence, gazing out at the Atlanta skyline. "Overwhelmed?" Julia asked gently. Ms. Harrington turned to her, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I keep thinking about all the teachers who aren't here tonight, who haven't been found yet." Julia reached across the seat, taking her hand. "That's a tomorrow's mission. Tonight we celebrate the first step." Ms. Harrington squeezed her hand in return. "You were always my most surprising student, Julia." Julia smiled. "I had an excellent teacher. Senator Williams is ready for you now." Julia and Ms. Harrington exchanged glances as they rose from their seats in the ornate waiting area outside the senator's Washington office. 2 months had passed since the foundation launch, 2 months of whirlwind activity that had carried them from city to city across America. What had begun as a chance encounter in Smyrna had evolved into a nationwide crusade. The senator, a silver-haired woman with shrewd eyes and a reputation for education advocacy, greeted them warmly. "The E.S. teacher warriors," she said, gesturing them toward comfortable chairs. "That's what they're calling you in committee meetings." Ms. Harrington smiled. "I've been called worse." The last 8 weeks had transformed her. Proper nutrition and medical care had restored physical vigor, but it was purpose that had truly revitalized her spirit. The timid woman from the bus stop had been replaced by a forceful advocate who now spoke with the authority that had once commanded classrooms. "Your testimony before the Education Committee made quite an impression," the senator continued. "Even Representative Donovan was moved, and he hasn't voted for an education bill in 15 years. Julia leaned forward slightly. "That's why we're here, Senator. We need to transform that emotion into action." The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, diving deep into proposed legislation that would strengthen teacher pension protections and create tax incentives for affordable housing developments, specifically targeting retired educators. When they emerged, Ms. Harrington was quietly triumphant. "She's going to co-sponsor the bill," she said, as they walked through the Capitol's echoing corridors. "A bill with my name on it, Eleanor Harrington from Smyrna, Georgia." Julia squeezed her arm gently. "Your students always knew you were extraordinary. Now the world is finding out." Their driver navigated through Washington traffic as Ms. Harrington reviewed their schedule on her tablet, a device she now handled with comfortable familiarity. The National Education Association at 4, dinner with the university presidents at 7, and tomorrow morning we tour the potential site for the first Harrington House. Julia watched her former teacher with pride. In just 8 weeks, the Harrington Initiative had raised over $40 million, established emergency relief programs in 12 states, and begun breaking ground on its first purpose-built community. For retired educators, a residential complex that would offer affordable housing, along with medical support and social programs. More importantly, it had located over 300 teachers in circumstances similar to Ms. Harrington's and begun providing immediate assistance. "Have you seen the latest from Smyrna?" Julia asked, pulling up an email on her phone. Ms. Harrington adjusted her glasses, new ones, stylish but practical, provided by one of their corporate sponsors. Principal Chen's proposal? Julia nodded. The school board approved it unanimously. Starting next fall, Smyrna High will offer a course on financial planning for educators, taught by retired teachers from the community. Ms. Harrington's eyes lit up. Now that is progress, addressing the problem before it begins. The NEA headquarters was buzzing with activity when they arrived. Staff members paused in their work to applaud as Ms. Harrington entered the building, a tribute. That still made her blush despite its increasing frequency. The meeting room was packed with education leaders from across the country, each eager to implement Harrington Initiative programs in their districts. As Ms. Harrington took her place at the table, Julia stood back, watching her former teacher command the room with natural authority. "Our vision must expand beyond emergency relief," Ms. Harrington was saying, her voice clear and purposeful. "While we must certainly address immediate needs, we must simultaneously work towards systemic change." Heads nodded around the table as she outlined their three-tier approach: immediate support for teachers in crisis, community development for long-term housing solutions, and policy advocacy to prevent future generations of educators from facing similar hardships. "We've identified 4 key legislative priorities," she continued, warming to her subject as she'd once done when discussing Shakespeare or Steinbeck. Pension protection, healthcare continuity, housing subsidies, and professional re-entry programs for educators who wish to continue contributing to their fields. Julia smiled, remembering the nervous woman who'd been reluctant to become the face of the initiative just months ago. Now Ms. Harrington spoke with the conviction of someone who had found her true calling, perhaps not so different from her teaching days, but with a wider classroom and higher stakes. That evening at dinner with university presidents interested in establishing Harrington scholarships for education students, Julia found herself seated beside the president of Georgetown University. "Your Ms. Harrington is quite remarkable," he observed, watching as she engaged animatedly with other academics at the far end of the table. Few people could translate personal hardship into such effective advocacy. Julia nodded. She was always remarkable. The world just forgot to notice. "For a while. And you?" he asked. "When do you return to Hollywood? Surely your studio is anxious about your extended absence." Julia's smile was serene. Some things are more important than filming schedules. In truth, her production company had been extraordinarily accommodating, rearranging the entire shoot to work around her foundation activities. More surprisingly, the media attention surrounding the Harrington Initiative had actually increased public interest in her upcoming film, proof, her agent claimed, that audiences responded to authentic purpose. The next morning dawned clear and crisp as their car pulled up to an expansive property in the Maryland suburbs. The architect was waiting, blueprints in hand, eager to show them the site of what would become the first Harrington House, a community designed specifically for retired educators. "We've incorporated everything you requested," she explained, leading them across the property. "Affordable 1- and 2-bedroom units, communal dining facilities, a medical clinic, library, gardens and classrooms where residents can continue teaching community courses." Ms. Harrington walked the grounds slowly, envisioning the finished project. "And the technology center, for those who wish to teach online?" The architect nodded. "State-of-the-art as specified, and each apartment will have adaptable features for aging in place with dignity." Julia hung back, watching as Ms. Harrington discussed technical details with growing excitement. This moment of creation, of positive change, was worth every red carpet she'd missed, every filming day rescheduled. On the drive back to Washington, Ms. Harrington was unusually quiet, gazing out at the passing landscape. Finally, she turned to Julia. "I've been thinking about expanding the model," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Beyond retired teachers." Julia raised an eyebrow. "To include?" "All educators, school counselors, librarians, support staff." Ms. Harrington's eyes were bright with purpose. Anyone who dedicates their life to education deserves security in retirement. Julia smiled. "Expanding the vision, I like it. It will require more funding, more advocacy, more work," Julia finished for her. "But that's never stopped you before." Ms. Harrington nodded, returning her gaze to the window. "When I was alone," "In that motel room, I thought my story was ending," she said softly. "I never imagined it was just beginning a new chapter." That afternoon, they met with journalists from 5 major publications, no longer the subject of human interest stories, but sought after for substantive policy interviews. As photographers captured images of them seated together, Julia marveled at how naturally Ms. Harrington had stepped into her role as the Foundation's guiding force. "You're a natural at this," Julia told her later, as they prepared for their final meeting of the day. Ms. Harrington's smile was wry. "I spent 30 years managing roomfuls of teenagers with limited resources and unlimited energy. Washington politicians are simple by comparison." As they entered the Department of Education building for a meeting with the secretary, Julia reflected on their journey. What had begun as a personal mission to help one teacher had expanded into a movement that was already changing lives across the country, and Ms. Harrington, once invisible on that Smyrna street corner, now walked with the confidence of someone who had found her voice again and intended to use it. "And this is how we diagram a complex sentence," Ms. Harrington explained, her hand moving confidently across the whiteboard. 20 young faces watched with varying degrees of interest as she dissected the sentence structure, her voice carrying the same passion it had 30 years earlier in Smyrna High School. The classroom looked nothing like her old domain. Sleek, modern, and located in the community center of the newly opened Harrington House in Maryland. Her students were no longer teenagers, but children from a nearby underserved neighborhood, participants in the Foundation's tutoring program. From the back of the room, Julia watched quietly, struck by the familiar cadence of Ms. Harrington's teaching voice. Some things hadn't changed at all: the way she leaned forward when asking a question, how she nodded encouragingly at tentative answers, the small smile that appeared when a student grasped a difficult concept. Other things had changed dramatically. 6 months had passed since their chance encounter on that Smyrna street. The woman who had once been huddled at a bus stop now stood tall in a tailored blazer, her silver hair styled in a becoming bob, her voice strong and clear. The Harrington Initiative had already raised $65 million, opened 2 residential communities for retired educators, and successfully lobbied for teacher pension protection bills in 4 states. But for Julia, the most meaningful transformation wasn't measured in dollars or legislation. It was here in this classroom, watching Ms. Harrington return to her true calling. As the session ended, the children gathered their materials, several lingering to ask Ms. Harrington questions. One small girl with braids and serious eyes tugged at her sleeve. "Miss H, are you really friends with Julia Roberts?" she whispered loudly enough for Julia to hear from the back of the room. Ms. Harrington smiled, her eyes finding Julia's. "I like to think I had a small part in who she became," she answered. "But yes, we're friends." Julia stepped forward, kneeling to the girl's level. "She's being modest. Ms. Harrington changed my life when I was just a bit older than you." The girl's eyes widened. "Can she change my life too?" "She already is," Julia replied softly. Later, as they walked the grounds of Harrington House, Julia marveled at how quickly the vision had become reality. The residential community housed 35 retired educators with a waiting list that grew daily. Gardens bloomed between apartment buildings, designed for both privacy and community. A medical clinic operated on site, staffed partly by doctors who had once been taught by residents. "The Foundation director called this morning," Julia said, as they settled on a bench overlooking a small pond. "The Chicago site is ahead of schedule. They'll break ground next month." Ms. Harrington nodded, her expression serene. "And the legislation? Looking promising in both California and Florida. Senator Williams thinks we'll have enough votes for the federal bill by spring." Ms. Harrington gazed across the water where 2 residents, former science teachers, were conducting an impromptu nature class for visiting grandchildren. "I never imagined this," she said quietly. "Any of it." Julia followed her gaze. "Having regrets?" "Quite the opposite." Ms. Harrington turned, her eyes clear and direct. "I've been thinking about something you said months ago, that stories have power. You were right." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by distant laughter from the children's nature lesson. For Julia, these quiet moments with her former teacher had become precious amid the whirlwind of foundation work, legislative meetings, and her recently completed film. "My daughter is coming tomorrow," Miss Harrington said suddenly, "with my grandchildren." Julia knew the significance of this visit. Miss Harrington's relationship with her family had been strained by her pride and reluctance to accept help. The foundation's success had provided a bridge back to those connections, allowing her to reconnect from a position of strength rather than need. "They're staying in one of the guest apartments," Miss Harrington continued. "Caroline, my granddaughter, wants to see where Grandma lives now that she's famous." Her smile held equal parts amusement and wonder at this turn of events. "Famous enough," Julia teased. "The Today Show called again, by the way. They want you for a full-hour special on education reform." Ms. Harrington's laugh was free and genuine, another change from the woman Julia had found 6 months ago. What would Ms. Chen say, her substitute English teacher, discussing national policy on morning television? She'd say she always knew. "You are destined for more," Julia replied, recalling the principal's words at their school visit. Actually, she did say that, if you remember. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Martin Taylor, a former physics teacher who now served on the Foundation's board. His face was alight with excitement. "It's official," he announced without preamble. "The state legislature passed the Harrington Act unanimously. Teacher pensions are protected from future cuts, and they've established a supplemental fund for medical expenses." Ms. Harrington's hand flew to her mouth. "The Harrington Act? They actually named it—" "After you," Martin confirmed. "Your testimony last month made the difference. Not a dry eye in the chamber from what I hear." After he left to spread the news to other residents, Ms. Harrington sat in stunned silence. "A law with my name," she said finally. "My father was a factory worker. My mother cleaned houses, neither finished high school." Her eyes glistened. "They would never have believed their daughter's name on legislation." Julia squeezed her hand. "They'd be proud. As am I." That evening, Julia brought her children to dinner at Harrington House. At 11 and 9, they were too young to fully understand the significance of the foundation, but they adored Ms. Harrington's stories and her gentle way of making them feel simultaneously comfortable and challenged. "Tell us about when Mom was in your class," her son urged as they finished dessert in Ms. Harrington's apartment. Ms. Harrington's eyes twinkled. "Your mother was brilliant but shy. She hated reading aloud in class." Julia groaned. "Still do. But," Ms. Harrington continued, "she had a gift for becoming other people, for finding the humanity in characters most students dismissed." Julia watched her children absorb this information about their mother's younger self, connecting it to the person they knew. The continuity across generations struck her profoundly. How Ms. Harrington's influence had extended beyond her classroom, to touch lives she'd never even met. After putting her children to bed in their hotel suite, Julia returned to find Ms. Harrington on her small balcony, gazing at the stars. "Penny for your thoughts," Julia said, joining her. "I was thinking about—" "Full circles," Ms. Harrington replied. "How life rarely moves in straight lines." Below them, lights glowed warmly in other apartments where retired teachers had found community after isolation, purpose after despair. "When I lost my home, my savings, my sense of purpose," Ms. Harrington continued, "I believed it was the end of my story." She turned to Julia, her expression peaceful. "Instead, it was merely a difficult chapter before something extraordinary." Julia nodded, understanding completely. Her own life had been transformed as well, not by financial circumstance, but by purpose. The foundation work had given her a mission beyond acting, a way to create impact that transcended any role. "The foundation board voted today," Julia said after a moment. "We're expanding the program to include current teachers, mentorship initiatives, financial planning workshops, housing assistance for those in high-cost areas." Ms. Harrington smiled. "Prevention, not just intervention. Excellent." "They also voted on something else," Julia added. "Starting next month, your role changes from founding inspiration to Executive Director of Education Programs, with a salary, benefits, and a proper office." Ms. Harrington's eyebrows rose. "A job offer? At my age?" Who better? Julia countered. You've lived the problem and helped create the solution. Besides, she added with a gentle smile, the board was quite insistent, something about needing a seasoned educator to keep us all in line. Ms. Harrington laughed, the sound carrying across the peaceful grounds where dozens of teachers had found not just housing but home, not just assistance, but dignity. Well then, she said with the decisive nod that generations of students would recognize, it appears I have work to do. Julia smiled, thinking of the bus stop in Smyrna where their journey had begun. We both do. 1 year to the day after their chance encounter at a Smyrna bus stop, Julia and Ms. Harrington stood together on a stage in Atlanta, watching as the red ribbon stretched before them awaited its ceremonial cutting. Behind them rose the imposing yet welcoming structure of the Harrington Teaching Center. 5 stories of purpose-built space dedicated to supporting educators at every stage of their careers. Hundreds of people had gathered for the grand opening. Retired teachers who had found housing through the foundation. Current educators participating in its financial planning programs. Politicians who had championed the cause. Celebrities who had lent their voices and resources. And dozens of Ms. Harrington's former students spanning 4 decades of teaching. Julia stepped to the microphone, her smile radiant as she surveyed the crowd. 1 year ago, I found my former English teacher waiting for a bus, having lost nearly everything after a lifetime of giving to others. Today, we stand before you having helped over 700 retired educators secure housing, provided emergency assistance to more than 2,000, and successfully advocated for legislation protecting teacher pensions in 17 states. Applause rolled through the audience. Julia waited for it to subside before continuing, but buildings and numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is about transformation, not just Miss Harrington's circumstances, but all of ours. How we've begun to recognize the true value of those who shape our children's minds and futures. She gestured to the building behind her. The Harrington Teaching Center represents the next phase of our mission. Within these walls, retired teachers will mentor new ones, creating a continuity of wisdom across generations. Current educators will receive financial planning support to prevent future crises. And most importantly, the voices of teachers will be amplified in policy discussions that directly affect their lives and work. Julia turned to Miss Harrington, extending the oversized ceremonial scissors. And now it is my honor to invite the woman who taught me to find my voice and has now found her own in ways none of us could have imagined, to officially open this center that bears her name. Miss Harrington stepped forward, her posture straight and dignified in a way that would be familiar to anyone who had ever sat in her classroom. Gone was any trace of the fragile woman from the bus stop. In her place stood a woman who had reclaimed not just security, but purpose, a leader who had transformed personal hardship into a national movement. She addressed the crowd with the clear, commanding voice that had once guided reluctant teenagers through Shakespeare. When I was at my lowest point, I believed my story was ending. What I've learned, what we've all learned, is that sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a powerful new beginning. The scissors flashed in the sunlight as she cut the ribbon. Cheers erupted, photographers captured the moment, and the doors to the Harrington Teaching Center officially opened. Inside, the building hummed with activity as visitors explored its thoughtfully designed spaces. Classrooms where retired teachers would lead workshops, financial counseling offices, a technology center for remote teaching opportunities, affordable apartments for visiting educators, and at its heart, a communal gathering space named The Classroom, where the wisdom of experience would merge. With the energy of new educators, Julia found Ms. Harrington in a quiet corner of this central space, watching the activity with serene satisfaction. "What do you think?" Julia asked, joining her. Ms. Harrington's smile was contemplative. "I think about all the teachers still out there, struggling, invisible, believing they've been forgotten." Julia nodded, understanding completely. Despite their accomplishments, they both knew how much work remained. "We'll find them," she promised, "one by one if necessary." "We will," Ms. Harrington agreed, her voice firm with conviction. She glanced around the bustling room. A year ago, I wouldn't have believed any of this was possible. Now I wonder why we didn't start sooner." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a slender man in his 60s, his face alight with recognition. "Miss Harrington, David Mercer, class of '93. I flew in from Seattle when I heard about the opening." Ms. Harrington clasped his hand warmly. "David, you wrote that brilliant analysis of The Great Gatsby that I used as an example for years afterward." His face flushed with pleasure at being remembered. "That paper changed my life. I became an English professor because of you. And now," he added with quiet pride, "I've established a scholarship in your name at my university for students planning to teach in underserved communities." After he moved on, similar encounters followed. Former students approaching one after another, each carrying stories of Ms. Harrington's influence, and each now contributing in their own way to the expanding mission of the foundation. Julia slipped away, giving Ms. Harrington space to absorb these full-circle moments. She found herself beside a wall where photographs documented the foundation's journey, from the initial hotel interview to congressional testimony to groundbreaking ceremonies across the country. "She's remarkable, isn't she?" a voice said beside. Julia turned to find Principal Chen from Smyrna High. "In every way," Julia agreed. Chen gestured to the newest addition to the photo wall, Ms. Harrington teaching a class of young teachers, her expression animated as she explained a concept. "You know what the greatest gift of this foundation has been? Beyond the housing, beyond the financial assistance?" Julia raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Purpose," Chen said simply. "You gave her back her purpose, and through her, you're giving it to countless others." Later, as the day's formalities wound down, Julia found herself drawn to the center's rooftop garden, seeking a moment of quiet reflection. To her surprise, Miss Harrington was already there, gazing out over the Atlanta skyline. "Hiding from your admirers," Julia teased gently, joining her at the railing. Miss Harrington laughed, taking a moment to breathe and to remember. They stood in comfortable silence, the city stretching before them. So much had changed in a year, not just for Miss Harrington and the hundreds of teachers they'd helped, but for Julia herself. The foundation work had reshaped her priorities, given her a mission beyond entertainment, reconnected her to a sense of purpose that transcended celebrity. "My film premieres next month," Julia said eventually. "They want you to attend, red carpet and all." Ms. Harrington's eyebrows rose. "Me? At a Hollywood premiere? Why not? You've had senators and CEOs hanging on your every word for months now. Hollywood should be easy by comparison." They shared a laugh, both remembering how unlikely this scenario would have seemed a year ago. Below them, the center continued to buzz with activity, teachers connecting, learning, sharing their experiences. The foundation that had begun with one teacher's story had evolved into a movement, creating ripples that would continue long after this day. "You know," Ms. Harrington said thoughtfully, "I used to tell my students that the measure of a life well lived isn't fame or fortune, but impact. How many lives you touch, how many hearts you open, how much light you bring to dark places." Julia nodded, thinking of the hundreds of teachers now living in dignity because of their work together, the thousands of students who would benefit from educators who no longer feared their retirement years. "By that measure," Miss Harrington continued, "this has been quite a year." Julia took her hand, squeezing it gently, "and it's just the beginning." As the sun began to set over Atlanta, casting the city in a golden glow, they remained side by side. No longer just teacher and student, but partners in a mission that had transformed them both. Below them, in the heart of the Harrington Teaching Center, the next chapter of their story was already unfolding, as teachers gathered to share their wisdom, their challenges, and their hopes for a future where their contributions would be truly valued. Full circle, Julia thought, but not an ending. Rather, a widening spiral of impact that would continue to grow long after this moment, touching lives they might never know, but who would benefit from the simple truth they had proven. That one encounter, one recognition, one act of seeing the humanity in another person could change not just a life but an entire system. And it had all begun with a chance glance at a bus stop, when she had recognized a teacher who had once taught her to see beyond the obvious and into the heart of what matters.